On the occasion of the International Women's Day, which we celebrated around 10 days ago, we will focus tonight on the rebellion's impact on gender relations in the Arab societies. When it comes to gender relations and women in the Arab world, Western commentators tend to focus, often in a very Orientalist manner, on the suppression Arab women face in their societies. Therefore, virginity tests and rape cases were highlighted in many medias. However, we should not forget that we all live in a patriarchal setting with all its consequences, as a recent published report of the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights entitled Violence Against Women, an EU-wide survey has shown. It was published last week, and one outcome of this report was that 1 out of 3 women in Europe have experienced physical or sexual violence in their daily life. Tonight, our speakers, Maya Mikdashi and Mariam Kirolos, will share their experience from Tahrir Square with us and their perspectives on the impact of the rebellions on gender relations in the region. Let me briefly introduce to you our tonight's chair, Helmut Krieger. He's a consultant to the VIDC and a lecturer at Vienna University. He's a social scientist by profession. Currently, he is working in the APPEAR project, Conflict, Participation and Development in Palestine. Now, finally, some administrative remarks. On your chairs, you find feedback sheets for your comments and critiques. Please drop them outside in the red box. After the panel discussion, you will have the opportunity to visit the exhibition La Philosophie Banane from Elisabeth Bakambamba Tambwe. I wish us all now an interesting evening and ask you, Helmut, now to present the speakers of tonight.
It's my distinct pleasure to chair this session on gender-critical perspectives on the Arab world. And we are for sure very pleased to welcome Mariam Kirolos and Maya Mikdashi. As Magda already mentioned, the subject of today's event is, on the one hand, a critical analysis on the ongoing uprisings in the Arab world from a gender perspective, and on the other hand, a critical analysis on what is perceived as gender and sex when speaking and writing about the Arab world. That's to say, we also will critically reflect on what we do understand as gender relations, as well as the studies of sexuality when it comes to the Arab world, given the fact that we are all more or less confronted with hegemonic discourses on the Arab world, which can hardly hide their Orientalist or even Islamophobic preconditions and presumptions. Given this situation, the following questions will be discussed at tonight's event. On the one hand, what does sexual violence mean in today's Egypt? How is it linked to power relations in the country? And how can brutal forms of sexual assaults and rapes during protests be effectively combated? On the other hand, what must the study of gender include? How is a critical analysis of gender relations connected to other societal categories and relations, such as class and race relations? And in general, how can gender justice be understood as an integral part of struggles for economic and political justice? These are main questions, and I hope we can answer them, or at least some of them, despite the limited timeline we have and despite their complexity. Before we are starting, let me briefly introduce Mariam Kirolos and Maya Mikdashi. Mariam is an Egyptian feminist activist and human rights defender based in Cairo. She is one of the founding members of Operation Anti-Sexual Harassment Assault, or PANTISH, short form, a group that is combating the growing problem of sexual harassment and collective sexual assaults, rapes against women during protests, especially in Tahrir Square in Cairo. The group patrols the streets during protests and fights off men as they attempt to encircle and assault women, as we will then see in a short video clip presented by Mariam. The group also provides legal and medical support and follow-up care to girls and women after these assaults. Furthermore, Mariam is one of the co-founders of the student leftist movement at the American University of Cairo. We're very pleased to welcome Maya Mikdashi too. Maya holds a PhD from Columbia University's Department of Anthropology, and she is co-director of the documentary film about Baghdad. She's currently associate professor and director of graduate studies at the New York University's Kevorkian Center for Near East Studies. At the same time, she's co-founder and editor of Jadalia. Jadalia, I think meaning dialectic. Jadalia is a free e-sign featuring English, Arabic, and French language content by academics, by activists, by journalists, as well as artists from and or on the Arab world, Turkey, as well as Iran, I think. Jadalia is produced by the Arab Studies Institute. So it's an absolutely a necessary and a quite extraordinary website presenting a lot of debates on the Arab world, and really you should follow it. Maya's research interests are, among others, sociocultural anthropology, legal anthropology, citizenship studies, nationalism, secularism, gender studies, human rights studies, and industries, liberalism and neoliberalism, and last but not least, refugee studies, as I have seen on your website. Among her numerous publications, I would like to mention just a few articles forthcoming. The following one: Law, Sex, Citizenship, Another Way of Studying the State in the Middle East. This article will be published in the Handbook of Contemporary Middle East History, edited by Jens Hansen and Amal Hassal. The next one is Queering Citizenship, Queering Middle East Studies, published in the International Journal of Middle East Studies in May 2013. And another one is Sexual Violence is a Crime, Sometimes, published in Afterwards, a Reader for Academic Writing in 2012. As I've already mentioned, a numerous articles published in Jadalia, the e-sign, How Not to Study Gender in the Middle East, published in 2012, and, for example, The Uprisings Will Be Gendered, also published in 2012. Last but not least, some words about the format of our panel discussion. Each panelist will speak for about 20 to 25 to 30 minutes, we'll see. Then, if you'd like to, we'll have a discussion among you, or some questions. And then we will open the floor to questions and comments. So, please, let's begin our session, and welcome, Mariam.
Thank you, and thank you all for being here this evening, and thank you for inviting me. I'll just start with the image of how we imagined Egypt would be on the 25th of January 2011 while we were protesting in Tahrir. Our chants were, the people demand the downfall of the regime, bread, freedom, and social justice. Our demands were very clear for 18 days. But then again, we realized after the downfall of Mubarak on February 11th, 2011, that nothing has really changed. And the regime is still there. We don't have bread, we don't have freedom, and definitely not social justice until this day. We were talking about how International Women's Day this year, March 8th, I would have expected back in 2011 that this year I would march freely in Tahrir and I would be even escalating my demands. I would ask for more representation of women in politics, but we were surprised and shocked. On March 8th, 2011, International Women's Day, our march in Tahrir was attacked by men. And people were chanting, "The people demand the downfall of women," which came as a shock to all of us. And we knew that there's still a long way to go when it comes to equality and women's rights in Egypt. The next day, March 9th, the military conducted the quote-unquote virginity tests on protesters in the Egyptian Museum. It doesn't come as a shock for an Egyptian protester that the military is the most, as we all know, the most patriarchal, chauvinistic, homophobic institution that definitely is not going to be in support of women's rights. Let me give you an idea of how sexual violence is being talked about in the Egyptian Penal Code and how it's addressed. In the Egyptian Penal Code, the term sexual harassment is not even there. Sexual harassment is a new term that we use. Before that, lately people refer to this crime as sexual harassment. Before that, people claimed it to be an act of flirtation. So the term harassment is quite new now, being used in the daily language. We have very few articles in the Egyptian code, in the Egyptian Penal Code, that we try to use to help women while filing sexual harassment cases. But then again, there are many problems with them. Let's say rape, for instance, in the Egyptian Penal Code is defined as a vaginal rape with another, like with a male organ, and it does not recognize rape with objects. Oral rape is not rape, anal rape is not rape, which means that male rape is not even recognized in the Egyptian Penal Code. And I remember one of the survivors of a rape incident in Tahrir that lasted for 70 minutes told me, "Mariam, if a train drove into my vagina, this is not going to be considered rape in the Egyptian Penal Code. It might be, if she's lucky, considered to be an assault case," which is very problematic. And the civil society organizations tried to raise this issue and submitted a bill to the government, but of course, the government will never benefit from such, I mean, at the end of the day, even if we have, and I'll get to this at the end of my talk, even if we have laws, there's no enforcement in Egypt to the laws, and the actual security apparatus is the one body that actually commits the crime. And I'll tell you more about the history of sexual violence used by the state as a political tool in marginalizing women from the political life. Back in 2005, on May 25th, a group of activists and lawyers and journalists were protesting in front of the press syndicate against Mubarak's constitutional amendments that would pave the way for his son to become the president. And it was not a very big protest. It was part of the Kifaya Enough movement that started to kind of, I mean, it was one of the movements that really started back in trying to, you know, calling for the downfall of the regime and having a new Egypt. And it was quite revolutionary at the time. What happened was female journalists were attacked by mobs under the supervision of the police, and prominent members of the National Democratic Party, the former ruling party, they were standing in front of the press syndicate, almost giving orders to people to attack women and sexually assault them, and it was quite brutal. And many women were, I mean, one of them got really sick and died a few years later just from the shock of what happened to her and how it took her a very long time to actually claim, having to tell people that the government attacked her sexually. That day, we call it in Arabic, Arba al-Aswad, or the Black Wednesday. And sadly, it wasn't the last time that we see the state acting in such a manner with female protesters in different protests. I'm sure you've all heard about the latest sexual violence incidents that happens in Tahrir, and it started off by, I remember it was a big deal and everyone talked about it first when it was Lara Logan who was attacked. But such incidents were happening even during the 18 days, and no one really talks about this. Only when it was a white, blonde woman being attacked that everyone started talking about, sexual violence, and it happens in protests. But it happened to Egyptian women, and it was never really highlighted in the media. But starting 2012, we've seen a number of incidents that happened in Tahrir, mainly in Tahrir, where women, and it doesn't matter what protest it is, it's against the army, it's against Mubarak, it's against the Islamists, sexual assault incidents take place, and it's getting more scary when it comes to the weapons used by such mobs in attacking women. Just to give you a brief idea of what I mean by a mob sexual attack, I can explain to you from my own experience. In November 2012, I normally march with drums in protests. I used to, at least. And I remember just crossing the bridge from one area to Tahrir when I heard a woman screaming loudly and running in the middle of Tahrir, which is very crowded. But I could see that she almost didn't have many clothes on. And running to her, just trying to help, and I didn't know anything about what actually happened. She explained to me that she was standing with her girlfriends when a group of people came around them and pretended to start a fight. And the next thing she knew, she was on the floor, and they ripped off her clothes and they raped her. And she was running outside of Tahrir, and at this point, as a protester, I just felt like, and the one thing she was saying, it's my first time in Tahrir, I'll never come again. And this is exactly why we started the group Operation Anti-Sexual Harassment and Assault, because we decided that we will have to resist by being there. Our very own presence in protests, claiming that this fight is also ours, was a very important thing for us to do. Later on, we decided as a group of activists, before the group was formed, to walk around in Tahrir and intervene in cases of what we thought was sexual harassment. Because sexual harassment is a thing that we experience daily. As a woman in Egypt, I get sexually harassed all the time. And it starts off by just me leaving the house, walking to take the bus, taxi, or whatever, and you would face all forms of attacks, catcalling, you can get groped. And the society accepts this completely. And sometimes if I shout and start confronting the perpetrator, I'll find everyone against me. And the victim-blaming culture in Egypt is not only limited to sexual violence cases, it's everything. If you are shot by the police, people will definitely blame you. It's just this culture is very, very sad. So later on, we thought that we would walk around with whistles in Tahrir and just call each other when we see a case of what we thought was sexual harassment. But it got very, very scary when we heard about Yasmin al-Baramawi's case, and I mentioned her name because she went public with it. She's a woman who was protesting in Tahrir, just like any other Egyptian woman, and she was attacked with the same manner. The difference is she was dragged and raped across like the perimeters of Tahrir, like in different, let's say, 15 kilometers of Tahrir. She was being dragged and beaten and raped by numerous men who were taking photos of her with their mobiles and laughing. And it ended by them putting her on top of a car, like still on the top of a car, driving and claiming that there's a bomb on her abdomen, strapped on her stomach, so people won't come and help her. This is a real story that happened in 2013 Egypt, and we dreamt in 2011 that it would be completely different for us. Yasmin is a very, very brave girl, and she was luckily helped later on by another woman who saw her from the balcony of her house, who saw a woman on top of a car, and she went down and helped Yasmin. Later on February 1st in 2013, Yasmin came out on TV and talked about her experience, and she brought what was left of her pants, which is like a little piece like this. It was probably where the crotch is only. And she said one word. Maybe if you see this image, it's on a wall in Tahrir called Mohammed Mahmoud Street. It's where we draw all the murals. And she said on TV, whenever I see Mohammed Mahmoud Street on TV, I hold my pants. And this is one code that we can all relate to. Anyone, any female protester who's been to Tahrir and faced some sort of sexual violence. I would like to show you a video now of the assaults and how they happen, and then I'll explain how my group actually works. This was taken on January 25th, 2011. So now you have an idea of what it looks like, what the mob assaults look like. The guys you saw in the end with white t-shirts, that's from the group Operation Anti-Sexual Harassment and Assault. This assault I've witnessed, I saw it while it was happening, and it lasted, I mean, this is a fast-forwarding video. This can last from 15 minutes to an hour or 2 hours to actually manage to get the woman out. It was something important that Magda raised. The man who has the fire is a bystander who was selling falafel or something in Tahrir, and he wanted to help. So he used the fire that he had. And I don't know if you heard towards the end, someone had to shoot a gun so people would go away. The mob assaults, that day we documented 19 cases of sexual violence, one of which a woman was raped with a knife, and she had to undergo surgery. And that's why we insisted that our group will have to keep on going, and those are the only cases that we know of. Operation Anti-Sexual Harassment, later on we added the assault. After such incident, we added a dash and assault because we can't really make the crime seem less horrific than it actually is. It's a group formed by a number of human rights activists and women's rights activists who decided that we can't just let this happen and let women be scared, because of course many women will decide to stay at home after seeing this. We decided that we want to do something about it. We don't call ourselves a rescue group. We just try to make the experience less traumatizing and horrifying for the women. So basically, the larger we are, we always manage to intervene before anything escalates to a horrific level. We decided to form ourselves into groups. So if you want to know how we function, we're divided into 3 teams. The intervention team, which is a team on the ground, stationed in different areas of Tahrir Square, which is quite big. It's as big as probably this quarter of buildings. And we are stationed in different corners, and whenever we see incidents of mob assaults, and you can see them. It's like many, many men forming a circle, and we call this the circle of hell. And we try to intervene directly. This group, the intervention group, consists of both men and women. We believe that the participation of women in all teams is extremely important and essential, not only because we want to act tough or whatever, we can do it, but also it's because psychologically it's very important for the woman who's being attacked to see another woman there to help her out. This team faces all forms of violence from people. We have many volunteers who suffered from brain concussion, many that were stabbed, many female volunteers were assaulted and raped in some cases, but they continue. And you have people throwing boiling water at us, sand, as well as the knives that you see everywhere. But this doesn't necessarily stop us from going, because someone has to do something about it. Because obviously the state, I mean, you've seen this video, it's on YouTube. You can see if the state really cares about doing something, they can easily ask us for the raw footage and detect who the perpetrators are, but they don't care. That's also a question that you will ask. Who are the perpetrators? Who are those people? Because the patterns seem to be very organized from the documentation that we've done. They start off the assault with the same manner, but of course there are some people who spontaneously, from the street, bystanders who join the assault. We don't know who they are, and it's not our job. There's a state to do that. We're not even supposed to be doing this job. We have young men and women risking their lives, vaginas, mental health, in order to help people to protest, just practice their basic right of protest. There's another group called the safety group that takes care of the women after the assault. We provide them with safe houses. So we have like apartments of people we know around the area of Tahrir, and we try to put them there until they calm down, provide them with medical assistance, legal assistance if needed, operations if needed, and we, from donations, it's a donation-based movement, we try to help out with the expenses, the medical expenses as well. The third group is called the Square Group, that walks around in Tahrir and distribute flyers of our hot numbers, because we also function with hot numbers. When people see incidents, can call us and tell us what happened, and therefore we bring more volunteers. And they try to also raise awareness on the flyer. It says what to do in cases of sexual violence. So not only do we intervene, but we try to make people intervene, because we're not experts at the end of the day. We're just a group of people who decided to do something. We have all the evidence. Yasmin al-Baramawi, the woman I told you about, who was raped for 70 minutes, she already filed a sexual harassment case. She was doing her own investigation. She found the car on which she was put. She took a picture of the car, the license plates, went to the police and said, this car, I was put on this car and I was raped on this car. Her case has been going for 1.5 years now, nothing happened. Just before I come here, I read about a case of sexual harassment, mob sexual harassment that happened in Cairo University today. And a TV show interviewed the president of the university, who said, yeah, I heard about the case, and the woman was wearing inappropriate clothes. So it's her fault. That's the president of Cairo University. So it gives you an idea of how society in general views such cases, and how we have a long way to go. One positive thing I'll have to talk about is the resistance of women, and how really when it comes to, people make fun of me when I say the revolution continues, because at this point, especially after the last events, everyone believes it's over. But knowing that women are speaking up, and having a woman come on TV showing her face and showing the clothes, what's left of her clothes, is such a revolutionary act that is continuing. And the number of women who are speaking about the assault is just, it's unbelievable. We would never imagine that this would happen in 2011 even. Just one thing that I also wanted to mention about Operation Anti-Sexual Harassment and Assault. During the demonstrations that happened against former President Morsi, from June 28th until July 5th, we documented 186 cases. By cases, I mean women. So we managed to intervene in more than 100 cases where we actually got the women out. Sadly, 3 of them were raped. And by raped, I mean brutally raped, and had to be sent to the hospital. And one of them was again raped with a sharp object. The question is, why do we continue to do this? It's because we get them out. I get pretty frustrated when we hear about cases of women raped with a sharp object and we couldn't do anything about it. But one volunteer, and he was also in the video in this case, he told me we get them out, even if they were raped with knives, we get them out before they die. And this is probably why we keep on going. And for now, we're very lucky to have some of the survivors of such assaults joining our movement and actually fighting back with us. That's why I'm very, very proud to be part of this group, and I sadly don't have the courage to be always on the ground because it's just horrifying. Everyone is being attacked. The last case I intervened in was on July 3rd. That's the day of the overthrow, like when Morsi was overthrown. And I intervened in a case where a pregnant woman was being attacked. So it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if she's old. Sometimes we have cases of families altogether being attacked, and we're having to get the mother from a corner of Tahrir, another daughter from another corner. Along with the positive fact that women are starting to speak and initiatives are starting, just not to be biased all the time. Now we have finally an article in the Constitution, Article 11 of the Constitution that was passed in January 2014. It bans violence against women. And this is a great step. But then again, we need tangible results on the ground. And I highly doubt that under military rule this would happen, because they sponsored the quote-unquote virginity tests. Later on, even in 2011, they amended some articles in the Egyptian Penal Code, like they harshened the penalty, but then no one is actually being arrested and no one actually is being charged and so forth. So I highly doubt that any improvements would actually happen in that sense unless the revolution actually succeeds. Going back to the first chant we had in January 2011, the people demand the downfall of the regime. The regime never fell in Egypt. We've only had different faces, once a guy in a military suit, and then another guy with a beard, and then back to the military suit. But nothing has really happened, and they keep on changing faces, but the way women are being, marginalized, the use of women as a political battlefield all the time. Everyone tries to win votes and win support by saying, we do that for women. They wanted to change the law about marriage and get the women, like, they allow child marriage, they allow whatever. Everything is still the same, nothing has happened. Female genital mutilation still happens in Egypt. Sexual harassment is still there. Rape is still there. And if it's, as Yasmin said, rape with an object is not even considered rape. Very little steps have happened. My only hope lies in women themselves and the support that they get from the revolution. Because at this point, I think the regime would be extremely stupid if they think that they will succeed in marginalizing women, because they've tried over so many years and it's failing. So women and their resistance and their presence in the square, and it's very sad that throughout the revolution, you'll always find pictures of men. The martyrs, you'll usually find them men, even though women die as well. When a man loses his eye in a protest, he's made a revolutionary hero. But then when a woman is raped during protests, even though she's also facing some sort of violence, no one will ever praise her and be like, oh, she was raped for freedom. And that's exactly what we need to fight for. We need safe public spaces for us to just practice our basic rights. But I believe so much in women, and no matter how the regime looks like, with a beard or not, using religious rhetoric or not, we are continuing, and that's one thing that I'm very positive about. So definitely the revolution continues in Egypt. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mariam, for your impressive talk, and thank you for giving us such an impressive picture of the fight you're organizing. So I'd like at once to give the word to you.
Well, this is a tough act to follow.
Yeah, definitely it is.
You're so inspiring. The revolution will continue as long as people this is it. I mean, this is the revolution. And the revolution continues everywhere, right? Revolutions can never be over. They have no end. I want to really thank Helmut and Magda for inviting me and for dealing with all of my requests and lack of emails. Also, thank you. This is a wonderful city to be in, and I want to thank Maryam. I've been a fan of Upandish, and I've been following them closely, and it's really a pleasure to be sharing this table with her. So I'm going to zoom out a little bit, because that's what academics do. They zoom out and then like to talk about things like the big picture. So I'm going to be speaking a little bit about how the uprisings have been framed in a sort of gendered way, but then also think about the ways that what work that analysis does in the world, what political work it does when we frame things in certain ways. So scholars, activists, and non-governmental organizations, NGOs, have long drawn attention to the regulation of gender and sex norms in the Arab world. This is not surprising, given the ways that gender and sex have served as civilizational markers in modern history and objects of curiosity by anthropologists or ethnologists. And here, it's very fitting that we're in this museum tonight. Right? This has been there's a very long history. And there's Miriam Cook has called this sort of obsession with gender issues in the Middle East and in the Arab world. She's coined this really useful phrase, which is Muslim woman, one word, Muslim woman, right? So this Muslim woman is always the same everywhere. She has no history, she has no politics. She's always this abstract sort of, and one of the important works we have to do is really insist time and time again that particularity and context matters. Now, over the past 3 years, and it seems crazy that it's been 3 years, right, since 2011, since Tunis, the ongoing uprisings and revolutions in the Arab world have brought into focus some dominant ways that sexual and bodily rights are framed, gendered, politicized, and depoliticized. I'm going to group these under 3 sort of very broad themes. Each one could be their own presentation, and that's what Q&As are for. They're the best thing ever. The first one is the equation of gender with women, or sexual and gender minorities. The second is the ways that gender and sex panics have been linked to a fear of Islamists. And third, the use of gender and sex violence to discourage or discredit protesters, what Maryam was just speaking about. But also, and within this, the discursive separation between political and sexual violence. And here, the coding, the sort of unspoken coding, is that political violence happens to men, sexual violence happens to women. Okay? And these are things that need to be disturbed, I think, very strongly. We're seeing this most clearly, I think, today in Egypt, but also in Syria, very much so in Syria, and to some extent in Bahrain. So I'm going to sketch these out very quickly, and then really pause on the third section, because I really want to think today with you about what the separation of political violence from sexual violence does in the world. What work does it do? Not only what does it mean to understand these things, but how does our analysis actually shape our engagement with the world? So, over the course of the uprisings, we've seen journalists and academics write about protesters, right? This one group of protesters, without mentioning gender at all or gender dynamics until somewhere in the article, female protesters arise.
Right.
Right? So similarly, in a lot of political science literature, and I apologize to the political scientists in the room, the citizen appears as sort of this like or category, right? The citizen is this large, abstract category until people speak about female citizens or LGBT citizens. And I think sometimes when we, LGBT meaning lesbian, gay, bisexual, sexual minorities, okay? And I think when we see these kind of things, we really have to stop and say, oh, okay, so is the protester male? And then the female protester? I mean, we really have to question the way that these categories are brought into analysis. So, and if that is not the case, why isn't that part of our analysis? Are men not gendered? Is citizenship this ungendered, undifferentiated thing until we hit female citizens? Now, if we believe that an attention to gender is important to understanding how women live their lives, then why not extend the same courtesy to men? It's only polite, after all. What power dynamics are being reproduced with every selective deployment of gender in the media and in every syllabus in a university which has 1 week on gender, right? So you'll have a week on, and that will just operate as the sort of like social, you know, women, family, social dynamics, and you'll have a week on a syllabus, and that's it. Now, we're seeing this logic play out again and again in coverage of the Arab uprisings, where the study of gender has really become a synonym for the study of women or LGBTQ Arabs. But gender is not something that somebody can be outside of, whether by choice or not. It's not a choice. It is relational. It is not an analytic lens that can be withheld and deployed depending on the genitalia of the person in question. It is relational in the fact that when we speak about, when we speak about the gendering of women, we are implicitly speaking about also the gendering of men. We're just not marking it as such, right? We're just not pointing it out as such. But when attention to gender is limited to female or LGBTQ Arabs in the Middle East, what it does in the world is that it reproduces the study of gender to the study of how other men treat their women and their sexual minorities, to go off of like a quote by Gayatri Spivak. Now, I think we should be really vigilant in questioning the ways that gender analysis is deployed and withheld at both moments, both when we see it and when we don't see it, so when it's operating sort of incognito. We must insist that everyone is gendered, just as everyone, whether they're rich or poor or middle class, is a class, right? There's a class analysis. Class analysis doesn't stop at only the proletariat or only the upper class, right? But somehow when we get to gender, we think it's okay to be like, gender means women, right? And what this does in the world, in fact, is that it reproduces male normative practices as the universal, which in any revolutionary struggle is what we're supposed to be interrogating, right? But then our analyses end up reproducing it, so we're caught in this sort of circle. Now, one of the clearest examples of the difficulties of thinking about gender in a sort of a larger way can be seen in the war on terror. Now, in the war on terror, obviously, we're very used to gender analysis having to do with women's rights, right? Oh, it's women in Islam. If you remember the invasion of Afghanistan, there was a lot about, the Taliban and women, etc. But what doesn't really get mentioned is the fact that in the war on terror, the male is such a gendered category, right? If you think about terrorists and the way that they're spoken of, or suicide bombers and the way they're spoken of, it's always in this very gendered way. Right? So if you look like Muhammad Atta, for example, right? There's always this idea that they're sort of sexually repressed, that they are angry, that they have complicated relationships with their mothers. I mean, literally, this is some of how in journalism people speak about terrorists. And I think, it's interesting to think about this in the city of Freud, right? There is a certain way of understanding sexuality and suicide bombing together, and yet that never gets marked as gender, okay? What gets marked as gender is what these men do to the women. That's gender. Rather than actually studying the way men themselves are produced as gendered subjects in the war on terror, as particular gendered subjects. You can see this also in the torture at Abu Ghraib. I recently had a very disturbing experience in my classroom when I said Abu Ghraib, and I realized that some students didn't know what it was. And this is in the United States because they were too young. It's very disturbing to think about this. But if you think about the torture at Abu Ghraib, so much of it was this sort of mix of gender culture, like anthropological knowledge and gendered knowledge, right? So why do you do this kind of torture? Because Arab men can't stand being sexually humiliated. As if every other man, it's fine. If you're like a white man, you're like sexually, this is fine. I'm not tortured at all, right? But there was an employment of cultural knowledge and sexual knowledge in torture. And yet, even then, we rarely use this as a gender analysis. We never study this as a gender analysis. Now, I think this kind of framing is actually politically irresponsible. Now, only if we think about men and women as separable, right, as if they don't live in the world together, they do not produce the world together, that they both inhabit. Only when women carry the sole burden of gender can you have an article like "Why Do They Hate Us" be published at all by Mona al-Tahawi, which was like an article that came out and was circulated very widely. And I urge you all to read it for an example of what I've been talking about. Now, a second prevailing mode of framing, gendering, and politicizing the uprisings is a fear of Islamists. And I think in many ways this sort of functions as a secular alibi. You can see this a lot in Syria and Lebanon and in Egypt. And I'll be happy to talk about this in the Q&A. But as Islamists gained ground in Egypt, Tunisia, and Syria, concerns over their potential gender policies really caught the attention of the international media. Now, while it's very important to keep this on the radar, we have to ask, why does this attention only come when Islamists are gaining ground? After all, have non-Islamist Arab political parties had such a wonderful and progressive gender policies all this time and we didn't know about it? This selective fear of Islamists really rests on familiar assumptions about Islam, right? Scary. Islam is scary. And secularism, which is sort of redemptive, progressive, and promises rights. Although we know historically some of the most repressive regimes have been secular regimes, right, in the world, in the history of the world. Now, many Arab secularists and thinkers and writers also dismiss the Egyptian and Tunisian elections primarily because the Islamists won. And many try today to discredit and have been discrediting the uprising in Syria/civil war precisely by branding it Islamist, as if the term Islamist is enough to sort of delegitimize something that's happening. I think that such a selective fear of Islamists has a lot more to do with Islamophobia than it does with feminism. For example, in my own research, I've studied the Lebanese legal system, focusing on personal status, criminal, and civil law for many years. And despite the way that all of these laws together form male and female gendered subjects, whenever I discuss my work, people always want to know about Sharia, right? That's all they want to know about. And it's this sort of like, oh, but and they'll listen politely, like, oh, yes, and then, what about Sharia? Right? And these questions always come after I'm very careful to say in Lebanon we have Catholic and Jewish personal status laws, which are in fact even more repressive sexually and in terms of gender. After I talk about the fact that the largest discriminations are actually happening in civil law with nationality law, for example, women cannot give citizenship to their spouses or children. Even after you say all and you give them this very complex picture of what's happening, the question is always, what about Sharia, right? Said in this sort of way, what about Sharia? Now, although, I mean, this is the case in Egypt as well, right? I mean, all of the laws that people are actually struggling with are civil, secular laws. But there's this sort of reading of it that it's always linked to Islam, as if really Islam is the only religion in the region, which it's obviously not, although it may seem like it in mainstream media coverage. And I think that when you see the same action, such as spitting on women who are dressed improperly, or stoning or throwing a rock at a woman who is dressed improperly, when you see the same action happening in an ultra-Jewish neighborhood in Jerusalem and in Riyadh, in Saudi Arabia, And if they're scripted differently, or if they're understood to be so radically different, you're not reading about gender or feminism or concern with women's rights at all. What you're doing is you're reading within a discourse about Islam and gender that already tells you the answers and the questions that can be asked. Gender equality and justice should be a focus of progressive politics, no matter who is in power. Unfortunately, Islamists do not have an exclusive license to practice patriarchy and gender discrimination. The secular state, with the full support and backing of what is called the international community, has been doing it quite adequately for years now. Actually, for the last half of a century, since the post-colonial moment in the Middle East. Now, the third frame that I want to sort of talk about today is how we understand dominant discourses related to the uprisings, and the ways that gendered and sexual violence has been used to discredit and stop revolutionaries and protesters. But what I'm really, I think, becoming more interested in as more time goes by is the sort of analytic separation that we make between sexual and political violence more broadly. Right? Sexual violence happens to women, political violence happens to men. The Mubarak regime and the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, SCAF, and the Brothers, and now Sisi, have used sexual violence to discourage and discredit Egyptian protesters and revolutionaries. Female protesters like have been subjected to virginity tests, which is really medical rape. It's another form of medical rape. And beatings and charges of immorality. In fact, everywhere there's been an uprising, there's been a gender panic generated by the state, right? So in Yemen, they were saying, oh no, women, and like this uprising is causing really men and women to mix, and it was a way to discredit the protesters, right? In Syria, the same thing. In Bahrain, the same thing. In Bahrain, actually, the sheikh went up and said, he made a call for public morality, right? Like this was like what was happening in the protest. The danger of the protest was the pollution, the gender pollution that was happening. Okay? And this is, it's a pretty effective tool, actually. Now, in turn, the spectacle of Egyptian security forces publicly beating and dragging a woman down a street is supposed to function publicly. It's supposed to function as a warning. It's supposed to circulate widely. These are not things that are happening in private. These are not things that are happening in hidden view. They're happening, you know, the world is watching, and that's the point. The point is the state's ability to violate a citizen's body with impunity. Whether that violation be sexual, through torture, or whatever, that is the point, and that is why it circulates publicly. Now, faced with the practice of sexual violence, we really shouldn't decontextualize it from the larger infrastructures of oppression that people live under. For example, there's recently, in the last 2 years, been an attempt by the State of Israel, which activists have called a pinkwashing campaign. I don't know how many of you have heard of this. But in this, basically the Israeli state has been funding people across the United States and in Europe, and really sort of promoting this discourse about where the equation of Palestine with homophobia becomes very strong, okay? So the idea is the Israeli state hopes to paint Palestinians as homophobic Islamic fundamentalists in order to further discredit over a century now of anti-colonial action. And over a year ago, Hillary Clinton, when she was still Secretary of State of the United States, made a speech at the UN about gay rights, where she called them human rights for everyone in the world. And she called on the Palestinian Authority to respect the rights of gay Palestinians, and not once did she mention the occupation. Okay? Now, I'll summarize or paraphrase how I read her speech, okay? What she was saying to the Palestinians. The promise of gay rights for Palestinians goes something like this. The United States will protect your right to not be detained because as a gay, but will not protect you from being detained because you are Palestinian. As a queer, You have the right to love and have sex with whomever you choose safely and without discrimination, but you do not have the right to be unoccupied, to be free from oppression based on your political beliefs, actions, and affiliations. As long as it is Arabo-Islamic culture and its manifestation through Palestinian law that is oppressing you, the United States is here for you. If you are being oppressed by Israeli colonial policies, you're on your own. Now, this is in part of the alienation of sexual and political rights, the ways that they've been alienated. But it can also be seen in liberal understandings of women's rights, or even human rights more generally. But homophobia, or sexism, or patriarchy is not one transhistorical thing, nor is it experienced in the same way or to the same extent by people the world over. Can we, I think it's a challenge sometimes for us to really think. So can we think of a Syrian self-identified gay man protesting against today in Damascus, against neoliberal market restructuring, or the Bahraini woman fighting against monarchical rule, without already assuming that they are already most affected by and most concerned with LGBTQ rights or women's rights? Can we begin to conceptualize people as human, as complicated, right? Not as these identity badges that then follows that this is how they should be politicized. For the majority of the people in the world, to paraphrase Edward Said, oppression is contrapunctual. It moves, it is multidirectional, it is adaptive, and it forms a terrain of interconnected injustices. Separating and emphasizing one of these oppressions helps obscure others, and this obscuring does work in a neoliberal identitarian framework, where the right to freedom is mostly articulated through the right to consumerism and to have a consumer identity. Now, the separation of sexual violence, of gender oppression, or gender and sexual rights from politics proper can be seen in many places, including in Egypt, and I think this part I might skip through because I could never say it as eloquently as Maryam. But in Egypt, female protesters have been beaten, dragged through the streets, and shot at along with their brother protesters, right? Now, these are political violence, right? They have been imprisoned, disappeared, and repressed just as ruthlessly as their male comrades. They have been pinched, grabbed, assaulted, and harassed by both regime supporters and their political allies at Tahrir. They have been stripped, they've been raped, in the offices of the police, of the medical examiners, and in the spaces of the public. They've been targeted and violated by individuals and groups of men on every side of Egypt's political divide. But sadly, this fact that it is precisely the violence and rape of women that brings different political factions together really shouldn't surprise us. The daily possibility of sexual harassment, assault, and repression forms in large part the female political subject in the modern world. Public assaults in Cairo, mass and public rapes in India, the fact that every 2 minutes a woman in the United States is sexually assaulted, or that, as Magda said in the intro, 1/3 of all women in the EU have reported some form of sexual or physical violence in their life. And we should all mention, people, reporting rates are always lower. So if you hear the figure 1/3, it means it's much higher, right? Because of the stigma attached to sexual violence. So all of these numbers are inadequate, and they're already shocking. And we really should, I think about that. But these are only amplifications or spectacular examples of the daily violences that people face, okay? Especially in the gendered violence that people face, in peace and in war, okay? We cannot continue to deny that men and women and boys and girls face different forms of violence, political violence, and political vulnerability in the streets of Homs, in a Jordanian refugee camp, on the streets of Beirut, in Tahrir, and in Tanta. Also there's been this sort of overemphasis on Tahrir, as if the entire revolution happened in Tahrir, right? This, obviously, historically, it's impossible, historically. But if we do continue to not understand the different ways that political violence functions, including the sexual register, if you just think about military tactics in Syria, for example, and if you don't have a gendered analysis and a sexual analysis of military repression in Syria, you're not really understanding it fully. I mean, your analysis itself is impaired. And yet, when you write about rape in Syria or sexual assault in Egypt, somehow this is considered a social issue, right? It's put in a box called gender studies, women's issues, socio-cultural dynamics, comfortably outside of politics with a capital P, right? Politics being you go, you vote, you do all these things. But we can no longer afford such comfort. So if you think about the events that have been put on since the uprisings, panels on political violence, for example, might not include work on sexual violence, which may be an entirely different panel, right? Probably one like the one here, where we're talking about gender and the uprisings, right? That's where you talk about these forms of sexual violence. But if you just had a panel on the uprisings, it might not come up at all. And again, I think this really has to do with the separation of sexual violence from political violence and the way that one is coded female and one is coded male. And these are similar to any of those who have studied histories of liberalism or philosophies of liberalism. It really maps on quite neatly to understandings of social, domestic, private spheres, political, public, private spheres, and the gendering within. In Egypt, this bifurcation of the social from the political has allowed Mubarakists, officers, CCists, and brothers, along with the regional and international allies, to set the terms of struggle for gender equality. Those terms, such as gender quotas for parliament and cabinet, family laws, birth control, are silent on the dire need for meaningful social and political revolutionary change. Right? It's as if women have different political demands, right, than men. And they can, women's concerns are obviously, family planning and this and that, and not, for example, neoliberal market restructuring. Right. Not, for example, police brutality. Exactly. Those are male concerns. It is these false dichotomies between gender and politics, between the economic and the cultural, that will and continue to impede the very possibility of transformative revolution in Egypt and beyond. But the urge to highlight one factor over another while thinking about sexual violence is very seductive. It is either culture, history, imperialism, or more generally that fuzzy thing that we all refer to as patriarchy, right? Patriarchy sort of functions somewhat like Sharia. Like we all sort of believe that we understand what it is, and we all think we're referring to the same thing when we say it. But again, patriarchy is a deeply historical form that gets articulated in different ways in different contexts. It is more difficult and less conducive to action to pause on ambiguity, contingency, and the ways that these factors, economic, political, social, sexual, gendered, are woven often tensely together in each act of sexual violence, which is itself a form of political violence. And I think this is where there really needs to be it's very important to continue a conversation between activists and academics, because academics are very good at telling you, you have it wrong, and it's more complicated, and you have to think about this, and have you thought about that, and da-da-da. And honestly, what I'm saying, it's much more difficult to actually do work on the ground, right? These conversations we have to continue to learn from each other. Now, to simplify sexual violence, to consider it a woman's or a social issue, or even an issue of human rights, is to degender and depoliticize it. It is to reproduce an unmarked universal, the citizen, the protester, which is the sort of mythological subject position, right? And it really fails to capture the complexity of political life in an age of governmentality and neoliberal securitization. And we really cannot afford these lenses anymore. Analysts and journalists who write on the Syrian refugee crisis or on Egyptian protesters and who use the singular voice, the protester, the citizen, They are really making a choice. They are choosing to address a universal that does not exist. I would like to suggest that this framing is a political act, and it does political action in the world. It imposes analytical limitations on the very possibility of understanding the various ongoing struggles for transformative change that we are witnessing. It reinforces a long-standing reality in which agents of power appropriate, control, and limit struggles for gender equality by folding them into things like women's empowerment, right? Women's development, women's participation. This folding pretends to sort of give an easy solution to gender violence and inequality, that these things will disappear if more women were to just exercise their political rights and enter the government and do all of these, everything else will just disappear. We know the answer is participation, democratic, that's the answer. It's the only answer. In today's global security state, it is not possible to write about politics without writing about the body. The body itself is both a medium and the primary target of modern politics and state intervention. The uprisings unfolding at the surface of so many beaten, broken, triumphant, and depressed human bodies have again demonstrated this. One cannot approach politics or revolution without a focus on the body, but also, and just as importantly, one cannot conceptualize the body without thinking through sexual and gender difference. We need political intifadas and uprisings. But just as importantly, we also need conceptual and analytic intifadas and uprisings. Thank you.
Maya, thank you very much for your really inspiring and wonderful lecture. Do you like to comment on Maya's presentation?
No, I really like what you said. Of course, it makes complete sense, especially when it comes to the whole women being, like having women. I mean, we now have women kind of, in the cabinet. And no one has ever tackled the issue of sexual violence, for instance. Now we have more women. The one thing I would like, maybe someone will ask in the Q&A, it's about, very interesting, you said de-gendering sexual violence, which I find a very huge challenge at this point. And it comes again to, I mean, the fact that now we're talking about it's very difficult for men. I remember in February 2012, a number of men came out to the media and said that they were raped in prison, and very little was done. Because if it was a woman, it would have, I don't think any foreign media outlets actually wrote about that. And it's definitely a huge challenge. So I don't know if there are any. It will take another male revolution. I mean, in that sense, like another revolution continues, but from a male perspective, I guess, in order to do this, and I don't know if you have any, advice in that sense, how can we do this? Because, as well, I don't know if I maybe forgot to mention that in my small talk, that men, our male volunteers, get sexually assaulted in the process of bringing out, survivors. That's it. Thank you, Maya, this was great.
Should I?
If you'd like to.
I mean, I don't have, like, this is what will happen. But I think that it's very important to not, to really understand the ways that sexual violence has already been gendered and coded as always female. And it's always a man doing this to a female, okay? So all other sort of constellations and possibilities of sexual violence disappear, including same-sex gendered violence, including, violence against men by women, which, I mean, all of these things disappear. Violence of men by men. And I think, to me, this became most clear when I was doing some research on the Syrian uprising and the refugee crisis, where again, even when male sexual torture was being discussed, or male rape, it was almost already assumed, like those men became women. The men, like in the act of being raped, they became feminized, okay? And it was almost impossible to conceptualize it outside of this frame, right? Outside of the sort of, oh, okay, which is the very basic, I mean, it's like the most basic gendered frame, right? You are penetrated, you are a woman, right? You are feminized. But if you think of Gaddafi, for example, remember when Gaddafi was caught and there was that image and he was, do you know what I'm talking about? The Gaddafi video when he was captured, there were people who were trying to anally, people who were caught him were trying to anally penetrate him in anger, okay? Right, and that moment to me is always striking when I think about the confluence of political and sexual violence. And unfortunately, I think it's become something that we cannot move beyond.
My name is Elizabeth Al-Himrani, and I'm rather connected to India, where I found, not about raping, but that the women who were taking part in the independence fight, I mean, they had a big standing that time, but later on, there were some heroines, so to say, some big figures standing out like Indira Gandhi, but generally their situation was not the same, let's say. But what I actually wanted to ask you here is, you were mentioning about in Israel some pink washing campaign. Can you explain a little bit what was this?
Sure.
There is one point which I would like to raise, that sexual violence in certain countries, in the Arab world also, in Islam, it is used as a weapon by governments to suppress their opponents. Right. I come from Sudan, and I know this is the practice. The police itself, in certain circuits, in certain areas, they arrest women, and they practice this for two purposes. First of all, to keep her shut, her mouth. Secondly, to humiliate her family based on the cultural background, and they wouldn't talk about it. And through that, they will even threaten complete regions. This is being done in Darfur, being done in other parts in the north itself, and so. So this is, I believe, need some attention, that particular issue. Then the experience of Egypt, and so this is happening in Syria now. The Islamists themselves, through marriage, they call it marriage. Those who are fighting the regime, they use the women are trying to run away from that, but they are suppressed, and so it is a weapon, also used by, but the issue, what is supposed to be done to solve all these problems? I believe one of the issues is awareness. There is no awareness in a simplified manner to go into this. It cannot be solved in 1 year or 10 years or so, but there is need to change the educational system. There is need to create, to use the media. There is need to make multiplier effect. Your group, for instance, in Egypt, yes, this is appreciated what you are doing, but with about 60, 70 million people, how are you going to handle it? Unless you have multiplier effect, unless you have netting. This is my personal view, based on experiences of NGOs in netting, in the multiplier effect in various aspects.
Yeah, thank you.
Like enabling women.
Thank you very much.
My name is Ali. I'm from Afghanistan, living in Vienna right now. My question actually is more common and also a question. Basically, what Mariam said about, providing assistance, medical assistance and legal assistance to the victims of the rape and sexual violence. I think what I wanted to ask that, as it was raised in the previous question as well, that Do you also plan, or are you doing some structural and cultural reforms as well? Because that's something which requires, a longer time, a longer period. Because dealing with direct and physical violence, that needs to happen just immediately. But structural and cultural reforms will take time. And also, as you said, that violence actually is included in the Constitution. So is there any definition what violence is? Because, when we talk about violence, then structural and cultural, because we in Afghanistan also suffer from that. There is no definition for violence, whether it's structural or cultural. And just one last question from Maya. About the gender issue, I believe that sometimes it's, when women raise their voice for their rights, it's, of course, they have to raise their voice and get their rights from their voice and get their rights. But my question is, sometimes I think that if a woman if women try to ask for their rights, it's kind of isn't it kind of degradation of their positions? Like, they should ask more for human rights. They should ask as a human, not as a woman. Does it make any?
Yes, thanks for your questions.
Thank you.
Maybe you'd like to start with pinkwashing?
Sure.
I think we have a lot of ranging from awareness to education system and the issue of cultural as well as structural frames.
We're going to fix everything tonight.
Yeah.
We're going to fix the world in this room.
About 9:15.
In 40 minutes. Okay.
In 40 minutes.
So just a little background on the pinkwashing campaign. This actually follows on a sort of hasbara technique. Hasbara meaning propaganda, Israeli state propaganda, that is actually used both. I mean, this is sort of the latest manifestation. So previously, there were always conversations about the equality of women in Israel versus the way that women are treated in Palestine. The fact, they always have this other propaganda campaign about how Arabs in Israel or Palestinian Israelis have more rights than anywhere else, and as if that somehow justifies the occupation of Palestine. Now, recently, in the past 3 years, activists have really documented ways that the Israeli Foreign Ministry has drawn up plans that include sort of gay rights within this framework. So the idea is, and you have these, for example, in the United States, you have lecture tours of Palestinian self-professed gay refugees seeking refuge in Israel. Okay, so there's an understanding and there's an attempt to produce Israel as a space of human rights, of equality, and to shift the attention from the occupation to the democratic and equal human rights of Israel. And gay bodies, queer bodies, and female bodies have been used as vehicles to produce this image. So that's sort of the background on the pinkwashing campaign. Should we go through? Okay, so
yeah.
It is true that sexual violence is used by both regimes and people anti-regime. I can say I don't think this is a necessarily, I'm an anthropologist, so I have an allergy to the word culture, okay? A very well-produced allergy. I don't think these are necessarily cultural problems as much as they are structural, political, historical, economic, all of these things. I mean, for one thing, if you look at, for example, the United States and the prevalence of sexual violence in prisons against male and female inmates by guards and by each other. I mean, they just released a study where they said a third of all inmates, and the United States has the highest prison population in the world, that a third, compared to population, a third of all sexual inmates have been raped. of all inmates have been raped. And this is a very much a mass problem of sexual assault. This is mass sexual assault, because a third of the prison population means like 2 million people in the United States. And yet this is not remarked upon, and it is definitely not considered cultural, right? It is definitely not considered something about American culture, which is, you know, which is just really into prison rape. Like that's an integral part of American culture. And yet when we talk about places like Egypt, we assume that the culture, that there's something about culture that we have to understand. And I think we need to be very careful when using the word culture for dramatic effect. The last thing I would say is that, you know, women's rights, human rights, if we start separating women, if we start thinking in that way, we might as well say human rights are male rights and women's rights are women's rights. And that's just not the case. The fact of the matter is that there is a patriarchal world system. There is structural inequality, and that is why when you say women's rights, you say human rights. It's the same thing. It's a reflection of the anemia and weakness of human rights that you even have to say women's rights, because they should be one and the same, and they are one and the same.
Do you like to comment on?
Yes, especially when it comes to what should be done. I mean, again, I said the downfall of the regime, which means like the downfall of an entire system that is so corrupt and damaged and has been there for years and years and years. And I mean, we all know how it's been in Egypt. But then again, I mean, from a person who's been working on awareness of sexual harassment since 2008, I can tell you very comfortably that the security sector reform is the key to many things, because we do have laws, even if they're not perfect. And now we have a new article in the Constitution. I'll go back to the question about violence, but they're only ink on paper. Nothing is happening. And I mean, we live in a police state at the end of the day. The reform in the security sector is the key at this point. We will have, or at least the enforcement somehow of the laws that we have so far, and we won't see as much sexual violence being practiced by the security personnel on whether protesters or just, you know, people who robbed the house or whatever. At this point, we've been working on this, which seems at this point like a dream, but that seems to be the main thing that we should start on calling for. And after we have the security sector reform, of course, things would be much easier for us. We can reform the media, how the media addresses issues in general in regards to sexual violence. The religious institutions in Egypt and how they actually talk about this case. Like I keep on thinking about if Al-Azhar one time would decide that all the imams on a Friday prayer tell their congregation that sexual violence is a crime, for instance, of course that would make a difference, but we live in a state that uses sexual violence against people, you know what I mean? So of course they're not going to be pro us raising awareness. Then again, it's interesting that you mentioned the point that how sexual violence is being used by the regime and people anti the regime. And also it's so interesting how everyone is like I remember I had to get in touch, or I had to be having a Twitter fight with Morsi's office, and from my Twitter account, the group's Twitter account, because they were saying, in protests against President Morsi, female protesters are being attacked. This never happens in the Islamist protests. And that's the argument that they used. And then I had to say, well, on June 30th, 2012, the day Morsi came to office, Natasha Smith, an English journalist, posted on her blog the title, "Please God make it stop," her assault that happened. And I mean, this is again, this brings us back to the point of using women's bodies as a political battlefield in that sense. And this is something we are trying to work on since 2005, since the Black Wednesday. Again, to the question of reforms, I think I just answered that. When it comes to violence in the Constitution, no, it's not defined. It's very vague, which is, of course, problematic. You know, they just want to have the word violence. The Constitution bans all forms of violence against women. Even domestic violence is not even the Egyptian Penal Code. That's one thing I forgot to say. So it's very vague, and again, it's ink on paper. We don't have a body that actually enforces the law. So at this point, it's just, yeah, it's baby steps. Yeah, thank you.
I mean, do you also understand the direct action of your organization as a kind of raising awareness?
I mean, I wish my group did not exist.
Yeah,
because it's just not. It's not fun. we don't need adrenaline rush or whatever. We had enough. So, of course, the impact that we're doing, again, I go back to the quote that my fellow volunteer said, we get the women out alive before they die. And maybe by doing that and seeing that someone is doing something, this will bring more rage in the society. And therefore, having someone like Yasmin speak on public TV about her experience, I mean, now people use the term sexual harassment. They say taharrush instead of mu'aksa, which is it's a good thing. Right. So we're trying to make a difference. So I'm hoping that by pushing for reforms, we don't have to have, you know, groups such as Operation Anti-Sexual Harassment on the ground. We're not, yeah. But we're actually, I do believe we're making a difference, even if it's very tiny, like telling women, we will be in Tahrir on this day, come. You know what I mean? We will try to help out if anything happens. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. The next questions. Michael.
Two very quick questions. One is about 14 years ago, the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 was passed that led to a lot of hope around, you know, it involves women's involvement in peace building and mediation situations, also in post-conflict peace building, looks at protection issues for women in refugee camps. I know Egypt is a bit of a special case because it's not seen exactly as a conflict directly the same way that some other armed conflicts that we think of are. But I just wonder from either of you, to what extent is this resolution, in your experience, ever referred to, ever used as a tool?
Sorry, is this CEDAW? CEDAW?
No, the UN Security Council resolution.
Okay.
So coming from the big guys, the big five sitting at the table. Or maybe connected to that, just if you have any thoughts or ideas for people sitting here in Austria about what either the Austrian Development Cooperation or other kind of solidarity groups in other countries can do. I know the situation in Egypt is quite complex, and perhaps there are other larger players who maybe could take bigger actions, but any thoughts you have for the audience?
Thank you very much. Yeah.
I would like to make a short remark to human rights, whether they are women rights. Also, human rights have their history, and when they were proclaimed, there were no women rights in there. And at the very beginning in the French Revolution, there were really white male rights, and they had to be reclaimed, and they had to be fulfilled with women rights. So also human rights has a story, but now women rights are human rights. They are written in. And I think this discussion, we should be over. We should finish this discussion. Also, children's rights were not in there originally. They were proclaimed and reclaimed afterwards. And I have a short question about feminist movement in all these countries you mentioned, because I'm very sure and quite sure that there are self-organizations of women. And did you talk about it? Because I came late, I didn't hear the first input, so possibly you talked about it, but I would like to know whether there are feminist movements who see themselves as such and self-organizations of women. I think that's one of the very most important things that women's movement or feminist movement needs in such difficult situations after war.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Another question? So maybe these two are quite complex ones when it comes to 1325 and feminist movement.
Yeah, I wouldn't really have an answer for the UN resolution because, yeah, I don't think Egypt would. I mean, we also signed the March 2013 Egypt ratified to the CEDAW, and I mean, international agreements, Egyptian laws, nothing is really being applied. And at the end of the day, what happens is what the state wants. I mean, one point I should raise, the protest I mentioned, the 25th of May 2005, the Black Wednesday, the women who were attacked raised an international case, and it was only being tackled by the African Union. And Egypt was held accountable for the assaults, and they should, I mean, they gave them like a period of time to actually re-investigate into the case, but of course nothing happened. When it comes to the question of feminist movements, this is extremely, I mean, I remember in the piece that I wrote for Jadaliyya on sexual violence, that was my solution. I believe that the formation of a strong feminist movement in Egypt, because it's not there. It's not there, and I don't necessarily have a reason, but I mean the fact that we are trying so hard to actually, I think it's not there for many reasons, generation gaps. Like you're having women that I respect so much that have been fighting for you know, women's rights, human rights, for a long time. They focus on stuff completely different than ours, and they look at it from a very nationalist perspective. So some of the women who challenged the Islamists when they were in power on certain issues, now they love the army. They can't really challenge the army. So at this point, it's very hard to form anything strong that fights nationalism and capitalism and all that unless we actually unify our ground. And I'm hoping that this will happen soon if we have a president who's, you know, who's a field marshal. That way, finally, people will understand that military rule is not the answer for freedom. Thank you.
I think that, I mean, there are as many types of feminism as there are types of people, right? I mean, there are all forms of, there are many, there's a long history of feminist movements in the Middle East, across the Middle East. But largely, what has happened is something global, which is that feminism has sort of dissipated, right? I mean, feminists aren't, there isn't as much anger, like productive political anger. Right. This is not something that's just in the Middle East and Europe as well, and in the United States for sure. You wonder where the feminist movement is, where it hasn't just become an NGO, where it hasn't just, I mean, no, seriously, like, you know, I mean, this is not something that is just in the Middle East. This is, I mean, and I think this is something we have to ask ourselves. Where has feminist action gone? Where is it? What does it mean to be working as a feminist today, as an activist, as a political actor? And how are these sort of possibilities already channeled into what we call reform, right? Which is not what people thought feminism was in the 60s and the 70s. So I think we have to ask ourselves this question. And it's really a global question, what has happened? And similarly here, I would just answer, I mean, I think this is a really important question, like what can we do here? What kind of solidarities can we form? One of the things that I always tell people is that actually to be a feminist where you are, that's something you can do, right? So like in the United States, when people ask like, what can we do for solidarity? You can say, you know, you should be involved in the American feminist movement. You should be like, don't just be a feminist for the Middle East, be a feminist here. Okay? Fight your battles, because if we really are interested in sort of gender justice, it has to be something that happens everywhere. Okay? It cannot be something that is marked regionally. And in addition to this, I don't think we can, that's the first step, I would say, is actually be a feminist in your context. If you want to be in solidarity with feminists in Egypt, be a feminist in Austria. right? I mean, that's sort of a basic feminist claim. Now, in terms of the UN Security Council, this is always a strange question, the UN Security Council. And I think a lot of what we've been what I've just said actually about what the fate of feminism in our neoliberal age is encapsulated by this question, where it ends up being a question about a UN Security Council. Right? Do people listen to the UN Security Council decision? As if that is a feminist sort of claim or a framework from which to understand feminism and gender equality. And the truth of the matter is, in the Middle East and in many parts of the world, the UN has no credibility whatsoever. No credibility. Oh yeah, nowhere. Nowhere. I mean, and especially the Security Council. Especially the Security Council, and there's a very important reason for that, which is Israel-Palestine and the way that the Security Council, and more recently Syria, the way that the Security Council has historically been a political tool of exerting global power. So I would say that if somebody, for me, if I was in a protest in Beirut and somebody said, oh, what do you think of the UN Security Council resolution? I would say, I don't really, I don't care. Who cares? This is nothing that affects, if anything, I see these resolutions as ways to channel revolutionary possibilities into questions of reform that only the state can fix, when oftentimes it is the state that is oppressing us. So we're asking the state to save us from its own oppression. And the UN resolution is, the UN system is nothing. Someone's laughing. I'm sorry if I'm being funny. I'm a little jet-lagged. I mean, the UN, the Security Council, is nothing more than the sort of, the superpowers of the world coming together, or who used to be the superpowers after the Second World War, coming together and sort of deciding things for the rest of us.
Right. Yeah, thank you very much. So, are there some more questions? Unique possibility to ask questions to Mariam and Maya and to comment on. Yes, yes, please.
Just the mic.
Please use the mic.
Yeah. Can you tell us more about this Black Wednesday you were referring to?
Right. It's the yeah.
Sorry.
Okay.
Sorry. Maybe there are some other questions.
Okay.
Yes. Maybe the last one, if there are. Yeah, there are some. Oh, yeah, sure. Okay. There are a lot of questions. Michael, the gentleman. Okay.
There was someone before me, so.
No, it's fine. Yeah,
okay.
Please go on.
Okay, because I don't really have a question. It's much more of a remark, or rather, I just want to say, well, thank you to both of you, because I really enjoyed everything you said. But I especially want to say thank you from the bottom of my heart and the bottom of my womb and the bottom of my vagina to Mariam for speaking out the way she did. Because, I don't have a great academic or political, history or anything very relevant to say, and I'm basically just here because my boyfriend's Arab and I'm just interested on the matter because of that. And because I've always been interested in things like that, but as you said, we have to be feminists where we are, and I'm really, always doing my best to where I am, and at the same time I know how privileged I am to be fighting in the context that where I'm fighting my fights, and being in this and feeling so connected to your fight, I just want you to know that you're being very, very heard, and we're here for you in whatever you need, and please don't forget to tell us where and how we can donate to contribute to your work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think we had another one over there. Rami. Franz, yeah, it's the gentleman in the green clothes.
So first, thank you both for the very interesting talks. My question goes to Mariam. I would be interested in the development of the anti-sexual harassment group after the events of last June and July, because I think as I kind of experienced, most of the activities of the group were focused on the period, particularly shortly before the fall of Morsi. So I would be interested in what kind of focus you took after that. Right. And I mean, you were mentioning the demand of the reform of the security apparatus. So is this kind of one focus you took for the group, or does it expand to other fields as well? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And I think the last one, yeah.
Thank you very much. Regarding the comment of Mikdashi, regarding the UN, actually, she mentioned only Security Council, not the whole system. I believe there is here, the Security Council, it is very clear because it is a monopoly of a very limited number of countries. Not everybody has the chance to be there. There are permanent 5, there are other, they have the control. This is the fact. That is why there is a lot of contradiction, there is a lot of weaknesses, there is a lot of unfairness, a lot, when it comes to Israel, when it comes to this. But on the other side, when you come to the UN at large, General Assembly, there are a lot of good, positive aspects, particularly concerning the rights of women, the human rights, even there are organizations specializing in this particular issue, and I believe this is, we should encourage and we should control and try to be part of the advocacy of NGOs, of women fighters, to clarify the weaknesses and try through those positive. There are some countries which are positive. They are working for that particular purpose. And so connecting with them, ask them to increase and to improve the weaknesses. And that is, I believe. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. So I think, Mariam, it's up to you now about the Black Wednesday and your activism after the military coup in July.
So I started off by explaining an incident that happened on the 25th of May 2005. That's the Black Wednesday, the protest that happened in front of the press syndicate against Mubarak's constitutional amendments. And that's when a number of women were sexually attacked and assaulted by mobs, by thugs. And the police was standing there basically supervising the attack along with other members of the National Democratic Party, Mubarak's party, former party. In regards to what the group is going to do after June 30th, we are not an organization. I mean, we picked the name in 2 seconds when we had to create a Twitter account. We're like, we should call ourselves something. We're not an organization, it's a movement, we're all friends. And thankfully, we have grown a lot till we're about maybe 300 volunteers now. So we're an intervention movement. We just intervene when there are cases, and we don't even work on awareness or anything. We do that individually through other civil society organizations. So I guess when it comes to awareness and the work that should be done, even pushing for security sector reform, this should come from human rights organizations and civil society organizations that are already there, and they have access to submitting, legal bills and so forth. But what we try to do at this point is just encourage women to speak. And when we hear about a story, we have a lot of publicity now. Somehow when people listen to us and read our Facebook page updates and status updates, we try to encourage people to speak up. We heard about, for example, that there were a series of mob assaults that happened in metro stations in the underground. We try to collect testimonies for documentation reasons, and even what we try to do right now. I worked on documentation in the past year and a half, and if women that are filing sexual harassment cases or sexual violence cases, we try to provide them with the documentation we have, whether it's videos or images sometimes that people take with their mobile, to try to support them with some evidence we do that, but there's very little we can do as individuals. We also have day jobs, so we can't do many things, but we try, yeah. In regards to the UN, I'm not sure if they do much, really, especially like the organizations that are specialized in certain things. I remember that I was very frustrated to hear the UN Women's statement on what's the sexual attacks in Egypt way after they happened. It took them a while. So, of course, I would like them to do their job without the political agenda. Yeah, thank you.
Can I add something? Sure. Just to, I didn't mean to be dismissive about questions of solidarity. I think they're very important. But I think there's a danger in assuming that the feminist struggle is over in the West, and it has to be achieved elsewhere, right? I mean, we've just heard Magda said a third of women have been physically, sexually assaulted, and that's a low number because that's the reported number in the EU, right? Clearly, feminism's work is not done. Clearly, it's not done in the United States, where women make 80 cents on the dollar to the male, or 90 cents to the male dollar. And I think there is, and clearly it is not done when it's not understood to also be part of an anti-war struggle, and I mean, like a serious sort of cohesive, coherent struggle. And one of the things, I think sometimes people assume that solidarity or the things that affect women are only the things that we already say these are women's issues. Right. So one of the things in Europe that would make a big difference, I'm sure, and would be a feminist intervention, is to counter Islamophobia. This is a feminist intervention of solidarity. One of the things, for example, in the United States, being anti-war on terror is a feminist action. Okay? Not only if it's about a female body or if it's about rape or if it's about whatever, then we are feminists, right? And you know, Layla Abu Lughad has written about this very, very persuasively, that there's a displacement onto the so-called third world, right? That is where feminism needs to happen. And what that does is it produces for us a false sense of security, and it depoliticizes, actually, and it stops us from working towards equality where we live. So.
Right. Can I add one last thing?
Definitely.
Sorry, yeah. about solidarity, because it was really interesting. After the member of parliament that I mentioned said that women go to Tahrir to get raped, on the 12th of February, a group called the Uprisings of Women in the Arab World, they called for a global protest against what they called sexual terrorism, even though I disagree with this, with the name of the protest. But protests happened in 35 different cities across the globe in solidarity with Egyptian women, which I find extremely good, and I was very happy about that. But as you said, for me having... Sometimes I feel from protests and quote-unquote solidarity movements that are created in different countries, I don't want to feel like I'm a weak brown woman, and they want to save us from brown men. This is not how it works. We're very strong, we can work on ourselves, and we can manage, and we've been managing for more than 7,000 years. But it's about me wanting to read about a breakthrough that happened in some country, even like in India. I mean, I think we were inspired by they're called the Galabai gang, the group of women with sticks that just, you know, intervene in cases of domestic violence and stuff. They inspire us, you know. I mean, and we kind of do the same. So I mean, reading about other movements and what they achieve it's what helps us all the time. Just, you know, some inspiration and footsteps to follow.